Hello, my name is Jessica Maurer. Today I will be sharing with you my presentation on Cognitive Theory of Multimedia Learning, also known as CTML. Throughout my presentation, I will discuss the researcher who developed CTML, provide a brief summary of what it is, and discuss 4 of the 6 proposed principles of CTML, including spatial contiguity, temporal contiguity, modality, and coherence. Cognitive Theory of Multimedia Learning was developed by Richard Mayer. Mayer is a professor of psychology at the University of California. He has been affiliated with the university since 1975. According to the University of California's Psychological and Brain Sciences Department, Mayer has conducted research on the intersection between cognition, instruction, and technology to focus on how to help people learn in ways so they can transfer what they have learned in new situations. With his main interest revolving around how people learn, Mayer set out to determine the best methods to help people learn and make connections with the information they are presented with. His main area of concentration includes the involvement in technology in learning. Mayer wanted to develop principles that helped individuals learn best when being instructed with technology tools and resources, whether it be from presentations, videos, computer games, or other technological systems. This led Mayer to develop his 6 design principles of CTML. These principles are multimedia, spatial contiguity, temporal contiguity, modality, redundancy, and coherence. As stated before, we will only be looking at and discussing spatial contiguity, temporal contiguity, modality, and coherence throughout this presentation. So, what exactly is cognitive theory of multimedia learning anyway? According to learningtheories.com, a cognitive theory of multimedia learning is based on 3 main assumptions. First, there are 2 separate channels, auditory and visual, for processing information. Second, there is limited channel capacity. And third, learning is an active process of filtering, selecting, organizing, and integrating information. In other words, information is presented to the learner through a multimedia presentation with words and/or pictures. This information is absorbed from the learner into their sensory memory through their eyes and/or their ears, depending on how the information was presented to them in the first place. For example, words can be absorbed by the learner through their eyes or their ears. This is because words can be delivered strictly through the use of text or through verbal messages. The information could even be delivered using both methods, just as the information in this presentation is being delivered to you as a listener. Pictures and other visuals are absorbed by the listener through their eyes. This information is then translated into the learner's working memory through sounds and images. The information from what was previously absorbed through the learner's eyes and ears is now translated with the raw sounds and images originally presented. The sounds and images presented should correlate with one another, thus making it easier for the learner to make connections and remember the information presented. Through these connections, we are obtaining and creating a verbal and pictorial model, thus utilizing our working memory to its fullest potential. Our long-term memory then organizes the information into meaningful blocks called schema. This schema can now be related to our prior knowledge and be moved into our long-term memory. Now we will move into discussing our first principle for design in CTML, spatial contiguity. Spatial contiguity is the idea that individuals learn better when written text is presented in close proximity to related images. On the left-hand side of the slide, there is an image of a right triangle and all of the degree measurements. However, the degree measurements are located at the bottom of the image. Even though the measurements are labeled either angle A, angle B, or angle C, the image is not the best way to present the information to a learner. The learner will have to make mental connections between the text at the bottom of the image and the correlating angles in the triangle above to make meaning of the information. On the right-hand side of the slide, there is an image of the same triangle, but with the angle measurements placed next to its correlating angle. This is an excellent example of a combination of text and content-related images. This information is easier for the learner to make meaning of and make connections with. They do not have to try to make meaning of the image and text because they are combined into one easy-to-understand image. The next CTML principle we will be discussing is temporal contiguity. Temporal contiguity is the idea that individuals learn better when spoken words or narration are presented in close temporal proximity or simultaneously to related images. In other words, when text is stated or presented at one point of a lesson and the correlating information is presented later on, it is more challenging for the learner to make direct connections with the information. He has to take mental notes of the first bit of information presented to them to try to retain the information and make direct connections to the additional information that will be presented to them later on. For example, if I present this passage to you, which reads, "During the last quarter, the number of sales has decreased and our production rate has increased," you as the audience must try to retain this information as I continue with the lesson. Next, I will present you with the sales and production chart that correlates with the statement I had presented to you earlier. Now, which quarter did I want you to focus on again? Were we looking at our sale rates, our production rates, or were we supposed to look at anything correlated to this graph in the first place? If the information had been presented like this from the start, we would have been able to make connections with the statement that is located at the bottom of the slide directly to the correlating graph that is placed above it, displaying the relevant information. The third CTML principle we will be looking at is modality. Modality is the idea that individuals learn better when spoken words or narration are used instead of written text and animations. By displaying a picture of a new blank PowerPoint presentation, I can give you verbal instructions on how to begin a presentation by filling out the title slide of the presentation, which is the blank slide you see. I can then explain the purpose of the various tabs at the top of the image and the tools available to you as you create a PowerPoint presentation. This provides a balanced system between the utilization of the learner's visual and auditory senses while learning. On this next slide, try to read the text and correlate it to the animation. No verbal messages will be used. This style of delivery is very difficult for an audience of e-learning. The learners are overloading their visual senses, thus making the comprehension of the visual material they are looking at very difficult to understand. It is much easier for a learner to depict information while viewing a graphic and listening to verbal explanation. The last CTML principle we will be discussing is the coherence principle. The coherence principle is a principle that should always be enforced when implementing e-learning content into a learner's educational agenda. The coherence principle regards taking note of additional information that may be hindering to the learning of an individual. This could be any added material in a presentation or technology learning tool that is not actually enhancing or helping the learning of an individual. The important aspect of this principle is to know how to decipher what information is necessary to remove from a lesson and what information is key to an individual's learning within a lesson. For example, the goal of this slide is to relay the definition of the coherence principle to the audience of the presentation. However, there are additional factors included in the slide that do not support the overall goal of the slide. The smiley face on the left is just a random picture placed into the slide. It does not add any educational value or support any of the information or the overall goal of the slide. The graph on the lower right-hand slide does not help support any learning on this slide either. Instead, these two images pose as a distraction and actually take away from the individual's learning. However, when we remove these additional aspects on the slide, the learner can focus on the main aspect of the slide and reach the overall learning goal. Without those pictures, it is very easy to read and comprehend the definition of the coherence principle. Creators of multimedia learning tools have to be conscious of everything they incorporate into their learning tool. If they incorporate aspects that do not support the overall learning goal of the tool, the audience's learning would be negated. Even though I only discussed Richard Mayer throughout this presentation, there are other researchers who also contributed to the creation of cognitive theory of multimedia learning. These individuals include Roxana Moreno, John Sweller, Jan Plass, and Wolfgang Schnatz. Each of these individuals were some among several prominent researchers who have continued to develop the cognitive theories of multimedia learning and cognitive load. Roxana Moreno was a former student of Mayer's and had begun to develop a cognitive affective theory of learning with multimedia before her death in 2010. She presented the idea of extending the cognitive theory of multimedia learning by integrating assumptions regarding the relationship between cognition, metacognition, and motivation and effect. John Sweller was well known for his theory of cognitive load. This theory is an integral theory that supports the overall purpose of multimedia learning discussed throughout this presentation. Jan Plass focused on the way cognitive load was measured throughout various tasks. Plass also was a key element in researching and developing the principle of interactivity. Finally, Wolfgang Schnatz worked in several aspects of developing the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. These areas included the three-store structure of memory, the science of instruction, managing cognitive load, and the use of animation and screencasts, and the overall evaluation of the theory. Without the input of all of these individuals, and surely several more, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning may not be the valid, applicable theory we have today. In conclusion, Mayer and his colleagues developed a set of principles that all multimedia creators should take into consideration. A creator must remember it is always important to take into consideration what the overall goal of the multimedia tool is. When creating learning tools, one should be mindful of several common mistakes that are made in the creation of multimedia presentations. When a creator assumes he is going to help his audience's learning, he should take a step back and thoroughly examine the presentation to make sure there are no aspects that may negate effective learning for their audience. Without the utilization of these principles, multimedia learning would be detrimental to a learner's education rather than beneficial. I hope this presentation helps you take into consideration some of the commonly made mistakes in the world of multimedia learning tools. Remember, take a step back and really consider your creation. You may have accidentally violated a CTML principle without even knowing it.